Ladies and gentlemen, after these very profound technical and medical presentations, I would like to make sure that we also include science, engineering, medicine in order to produce a greater understanding, a big picture. Now I would like to talk about what I thought about these four concepts, this quadriga. Maybe I could catch up, but I guess nobody is less capable of cutting down their presentation to a smaller size. But anyway, I'll try my best anyway. As mentioned in my introductory article, this prayer mill-like evocation of this quadriga of narratives, cyber, asymmetry, hybridity and resilience could conceal in places even unconscious attempts to hide or mask the failures of European strategic survival assurance, or to convey the feeling that this could remedy existential threats by keeping on talking about this four-tiered magic formula. So I think the word asymmetry could have been added to cyber, because asymmetry is the more fundamental logic. What this is about is to come up with a trick and an idea in order to outmaneuver your opponent that is stronger than you are, whether this is by a better or an older technology. So the important is that the opponent cannot keep up. So if, according to my hypothesis, this were old wine in new wineskins, so a contemporary trend that will give the current security policy debate a new lease of life and more attractiveness, or give the impression of a higher expertise, and little would be gained, but on the other side no harm would be done. If these are indeed completely new phenomena, then a fundamental scientific and overall strategic examination and a complete reassessment would be absolutely necessary. However, it is obvious at a first glance that the origin of all four phenomena is to be attributed to past developments. If this is merely a compilation of thematic categories, an evaluation grid of sorts, by means of which indicators of crises can be systematically recorded, this could be seen as a helpful instrument for strategic decision-making, but it doesn't justify the importance it is accorded in the current security policy discourse. However, it is going to become more dangerous if one understands this quadriga as a narrative built up from the, synergetically interwoven elements of cyber, asymmetry, hybridity and resilience, and is used to excuse a lack of strategic reach and defense over the uncontrollable complexity, this superiority of the new phenomena to which the Western world has nothing to oppose, and to generate the deceptive feeling that just knowing about these elements, of these four elements and their interaction, could create a remedy in security. Or where it actually would at least be appropriate to show covert remorse as an artistic excuse for not having to admit to misjudgments in the past. In fact, where the new art concepts coincide with old ones, the suspicion arises that principles from the past have been denied on the grounds of political correctness, and these still may be valid, gaining topical validity in view of the increasing critical security situation. And now they're also recognized by the political mainstream, albeit under a different name, of course, nilly-willy. How long has the dogma of that been maintained that only politically or contractually agreed borders drawn on the map would determine national identity? Today, a multitude of conflicts and critical decay scenarios show that it is not only borderlines, treaties and constitutions, but also the founding myths, language, culture, religion, ethnicity and ideology give rise to a sense of identity. And this brings us back to the hitherto frowned upon concept of culture and popular character of Oswald Spengler, the demise of the West. Now, what is truth? Asked Friedrich Nietzsche. And the answer is it's a mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which, poetically and rhetorically increased, transmitted, adorned, and which after a long period of use seem firm, canonical, and binding to people. The truths are illusions that one has forgotten. They are metaphors that have become worn out and devoid of power, coins that have lost their image and now come into consideration only as metal and no longer as coins. Now, I'm wondering, isn't this an ideal metaphor for the narrative? I'm trying to go through the individual points, and then I come back to the idea of the Trojan horse. So both the definition of Nietzsche and also the definition of narrative that I'm trying to use here, it affects the opponents and our own. Narrative is not only here to influence the opponent, but also our own population. So both principles stand between the founding myth and a seeming explanation and ideology. Both concepts describe like the head of Janus or Janus. On the one hand, there's the kit, it's the putty that or the glue that keeps together the system, without which it would break apart. But there's also the system of the political elites in order to show people a different picture. And then the coherence of the opponent should be weakened, and maybe your own offensive could be weakened. So narratives are supported by the people. They can be easily, well, they're vulnerable and they can erode. They cannot be maintained with violence. They cannot be imposed upon others with violence. They can be changed either by honest conviction or through demagogy. That's the two-sidedness, this double-edged sword. To maintain the coherence of one's own state, we need more conviction. When it comes to dealing with other ethnic groups in your own country, to weaken the coherence of the opponent and to support one's own position, it is the distortion of reality. When it comes to humanitarian interventions. So that's the basic idea of the Trojan horse that is trying to distort reality, to weaken the defensive power of the opponent, and to move him to open the gates himself. We recognize that Western societies begin to develop a certain understanding for the offensive objectives, even directed against themselves, as soon as there is at least a credible narrative that is offered. Where their own cohesive narrative fades away due to a postmodern development, and their own state, due to a lack of strategic sensitivity and purpose, strengthens the conviction underlying their own narrative. So the definition of narrative, in particular, is meeting a postmodern society in need of harmony, according to Griffith, which develops a fatal tendency to no longer perceive developments as threatening if they can be explained, even if only through fictitious logics, because you can no longer defend yourself against what is reasonably explained, and thus you avoid the fight. This is almost reminiscent of the Stockholm Syndrome. There's a certain tendency to trust the aggressor and his explanations to avoid a fight, sometimes even to spread and reinforce these narratives in one's own cultural space. So political coverage and societal discourse are just examples. No matter whether this is done for lack of knowledge or because you believe the opponent's rhetoric or out of a postmodern harmonious denial of reality, the effect is the same. Now, what I conclude from that is that the phenomenon of a narrative is not new. The one who tells a story hasn't changed, just the audience have changed. So to emerge from an exaggeratedly harmonious, seemingly critical and easily seducible postmodern society. And that leaves, of course, the leaves become the wind of the narratives. So this can be taken back to the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard with this work, La condition postmoderne, rapport sur le savoir. And he says that les grands récits or les méta-récits There's the grand narratives, or master narratives in English. Well, and those of Immanuel Kant, of freeing the individual, and Hegel, history has one goal, Marx, the dialectical materialism, exchanging thesis and antithesis, and also Christianity and the Occident. I'm saying that there's also the claim to power of a Germanic race in the Third Reich. So Lyotard says that postmodernism is the end of the great narratives, because in a postmodern, enlightened world, the narrative no longer acts as a glue. It's no longer necessary. So facts show that maybe Lyotard was wrong, because narratives have again gained in power in two respects. Once as a narrative that equally strengthen the coherence and that legitimize offensive approaches both internally towards your own population and externally towards your opponent, and those with which reality is distorted and presented to your own people in such a way that a strategy deficit, the neglected defense efforts, and taking a higher strategic risk are no longer perceived as threatening. As examples for the first quality, I could say that the idea race plus Christianity in Russia is about to close the gap left by communism. Ukraine, as the cradle of ethnic Russianity, the privileged interests abroad, which were clearly signaled and reported to the West in all Russian strategy documents, and guarantees Russia a right of intervention, where the rights of ethnic Russian minorities are at least allegedly endangered. This very figure of argument does not exactly create a reassuring certainty that an analogous approach could not be thought of in the Baltic, or that the suggestion of the potential possibility that there's no pleonasm, because there are possibilities that are based on intentions or based on potentials. And I believe that, potential possibilities, and I don't mean a pleonasm or a redundancy. So, indicating these possible potentialities are not used in order to, motivate the opponent in the direction of the potential. To the extent that Western understanding for this narrative is raised, the European pressure of suffering decreases, and a sense of responsibility to assist states that are affected by actual fighting. Of course, this would have fatal consequences at the moment when this fighting affects a NATO member state. For the time being, however, the narrative faith still reduces the drive to ramp up conventional capabilities. Then there's fundamentalist Islam, which is a fighting religion directed against Christianity and Judaism, with a global claim to expansion. And, of course, it also has a narrative dimension. Then there's the Silk Road of China, which goes far beyond this idea of this bridge between civilizations. Of course, it's about spreading the Chinese influence through means of high tech, with big data collection and no influence from abroad being tolerated. And this is in parallel to what's happening in America, England, the Nordic countries, then the BRICS, the second parallel Panama Canal. So we are seeing that in Central Europe we actually have a perception of the real threat that is quite naive. So all the scenarios of state disintegration in those contractual political boundaries that prescribe national identity to all living within these boundaries counter ethnically motivated founding myths or facts of origin. Even highly developed European countries such as Spain, Italy, or Ireland are not immune to such secessionist tendencies. And of course there's also the idea of the Pax Americana, the American peace theory that could lead to a turnaround. And then there's the other quality, the quality where one's own population is quieted through this distorted view of reality, This refers to cyberspace and resilience. Now, I'll come back to that later. If we assume that a narrative is possibly the overarching structure and concept, so could cyber, asymmetry, resilience, and hybridity, since they cannot be seen in isolation, but they always synergistically lead to narrative. Maybe these are in themselves part of a narrative, and with which Europe's lack of strategic capability could explain, excuse, denied, or even allegedly fought. And in a short analysis, I'll try to refer to some of these phenomena to go into some more detail. So basically, this hybridity or Hybridizität in German, I just wanted to differentiate myself from the botanical term. So hybridity would have been just as okay as Hybridizität. So in future, I will only use hybridity. Now, I'm saying that all wars in the world were hybrid. Only the battle could be organized in such a way that civilians or civilian infrastructure were largely left out or untouched, even though this isn't true everywhere. Napoleon, Moscow, the 30-Year War, Hannibal's looting and the march in Spain. So hybridity also existed in Thucydides and Sun Tzu. So the greatest range of threats to be considered of military and non-military countermeasures and exponentially increased complexity of the procedures for coordinating countermeasures, which must contain the ultimate ratio of military means of power as one of the elements in a threat-appropriate manner, shows, however, that ME's contribution to political consulting is indispensable today. This concerns strategic consulting and also training for strategic thinking. So the conceptual starting point was negatively connotated hybrid threats, which required the ability for hybrid warfare as a mirror image reaction. So the concept of hybridity was more clearly defined by Hoffmann and Mattis, as we heard today. So it's a combination of novel approaches emerged of different modes of war. And there's a short explanation here that I'd like to briefly touch upon. So that means that even if in classical warfare, military and non-military means had to be used together, so economic, political, diplomatic, resource-related, and psychological and social dimensions had to be converging, this also applies today. Even though the character and characteristics of the areas to be included may have changed, their relative weighting may have shifted. So the character of war, as this quote says, will continue to remain in breaking the enemy's will and, as a last resort, as a military means. Which means that the military will, in any case, have to remain one of the areas to be consulted. So it can be observed that in the security policy debate is increasingly trying to give the impression that a greatly increased number of areas to be included would make it possible to marginalize military resources, to compensate, to substitute them by a multidimensional connection of a multitude of non-military areas. And here I believe this is where the wrong judgment comes in, and this not quite honest narrative towards one's own population. So postmodern societies try to interpret hybridity in such a way that the wide range of non-military instruments could guarantee security even without effective armed forces, thus violating the core logic of Mattis and Hoffmann that the nature of war cannot change. So that the nature of war cannot change. The hope of being able to guarantee security solely through talks, negotiations, economic measures, and the control of trade relations, and thus to spare oneself the development of abilities and the use of armed forces, must turn out to be a misconception. So, of course, this inevitably reminds us of the hatred and the enmity of Clausewitz. Clausewitz talks about physical violence, which equips itself with inventions of the arts and sciences to counter violence, which could also be used to conclude that this goes beyond the spiritual dimension of warfare, where he goes far beyond of what Kant, Hegel, and Nietzsche said, who perceived the war as a comprehensive phenomenon. And they anticipated hybridity in today's sense. But like Hoffmann and Mathis, they never shook the immutability of the nature of war. And thus, they consequently never thought of war in which the armed forces would not have represented the ultimate ratio of the decision. Now, this is a Lavak publication. That's a graph of Deng Shurian, which refers to different approaches that can be used in terms of hard power and soft power. In connection with the annexation of Crimea and, Russia was accused of actions in violation of international law and breaches of contracts, which Russia has always rejected. This unassailability of Russia at the threshold of legality became a symbol of hybridity. The most recent crystallization point for discussions about the importance of hybridity were thus the little green men with whom the Russian offensive against the Ukraine was launched. So, of course, let me talk about maths, with a formula or an equation that is ridiculous almost to most people here, I guess. It was thought that the threat is the potential times intention times political will. So if the product is zero, the potential or will is zero. So a Western state doesn't have to react. So if it's a lot of potential without intention, or vice versa, then Europe would not need to take action. So this is not true, because a potential without intention can generate an opposite intention that didn't exist before. So it can be that by a power vacuum on the one hand, this can generate an intention to attack where it didn't exist previously. So it is the cherries on the tree that make you want to eat cherries. And if the cherries hadn't been there, you wouldn't have wanted to eat cherries. But the bad thing about this is that today's perception shows that the entire formula, the entire equation no longer works that way. So now, however, this formula, threat is potential times intention, this may no longer apply. The entire Western world judges that a rapid Russian attack towards the West has no rational chance of success and opens no usable political goals, lies far from any logistical security or sustainability or benefit to be expected, and is therefore thoroughly unlikely. Even the Russian strategists are saying that, and we believe there is no logical reason for such a belief. There is no rational basis to believe that Putin was irrational enough that he might try it anyway. So if you use logic, include all factors, well, you may consider that this wouldn't make sense and wouldn't happen. Such an attack waged by Russia against the West. So there is no realistic intention. So it can only be a hypothetical potential, and well, fatally, in today's reality, this pure potential creates a reality, but only because there is a blatant power vacuum on the other side. So such a potential is not seen as meaningful. The forward deployment of US equipment in Poland, NATO accession discussion in Scandinavian countries, delivery of JASM to Poland, which reaches from Helsinki to Moscow, to Poland and Finland, a diversified sensor threat on the north flank and the central region, the 2% Wales target, the German brigade in the Baltic states, the very high readiness joint task force in PESCO. So these are just a few examples that show that an unintentional potential can create a reality. So this potential creates a reality. Now, if you ask me what's strategic, if that isn't strategic, that you can stand there and say, please check me out. I have no intention to attack, and logically speaking, I can't have it. I'm just doing what is my due. This is my own territory, and I'm just accumulating potential, and thus I'm creating a strategic reality, and I can't be reproached for it. Now, if that isn't strategy, what else? And potentially, through this diversified threat that you create, you can weaken the coherence of the NATO states without having done anything that is against the law. Now, if you take these 15 Category A divisions and a Northern Army Command, well, if you consider this, I believe that this is a stroke of genius rather than irrational. So it is this seemingly unintended potential that moves the strategy, and not the little green men in the Ukraine. So this perceived Gerasimov doctrine is based on this strategy, but it is not the basis. That's just the way it is perceived. The Western perception of the Gerasimov doctrine becomes a narrative again. This published 2-page interview, that's all it is only the tip of the iceberg of Russia's much larger, comprehensive recursive strategy. Professor Spira is an expert in the area of recursive strategy, and we're probably going to hear more of that. Things such as influencing the elections in the US, the support of Brexit, would be further indicators of such a major recursive strategy. What's assumed is a continuum of relative peace all the way to the actual outbreak of armed conflict. The doctrine, if indeed it is one, aims to keep the greatest possible part of this escalation below the threshold of Article 5, those little green men. This doctrine is presented as a stroke of genius of Russian strategic thinking that the West is helplessly exposed to. But it's a fact that it would only be a major strategic achievement if the measures that lie below the Article 5 threshold were disguised so that NATO doesn't recognize them. But in reality, these measures are recognized by the West and and used by Russia in such an ostentatious way that the West is actually, pushed into it with their nose, and they have to recognize that these must be measures prepared for attack. The powerlessness of Europe is deliberately used here, according to the motto, Europe is glad that it can claim that it cannot react beneath Article 5, because otherwise it would have to react, but couldn't, because due to the lack of capabilities. So the whole Article 5 discussion shows that one does indeed think that the idea of Ukraine, Crimea, against all judgment, that it could be transferred to NATO territory. Otherwise, the Article 5 discussion wouldn't make any sense, because Ukraine isn't part of NATO. So if one wanted to react, one would have to do nothing than take measures that are, presented by reasoning with the little green men, but that have de facto a preparatory effect for attack by including them in Article 5, by amending the treaty. But that exactly isn't done. Now, this takes me to the concept of resilience. I'm like a minister, Ms. Kneissl. I'm not really a great friend of resilience, because resilience, when we say the word, it's appeared to be something static. We are pleased that things are the way they are, and any change is risky. As long as we play dead, we are safe, and this is why we stay in this condition. This static resilience leads to rigidity in thinking. All the major strategic operative thinkers that fell for resilience actually failed in the long term. Now, let me give an example. A ball that lies at the top of a cone is not resilient. A ball on a flat table is a bit more resilient. A ball in a saucepan is more resilient because it cannot fall to the ground. So it remains in there. But my heretical statement is that if you only want to keep the ball in place, I'll just nail it to the ceiling. It'll stay there forever, come what may, wind and rain, bad visibility. So the objective should not be to keep a ball in place. The ball should be able to roll. So this gives me the idea that actually we should have a little tilting board where the ball rolls down, and then it can be steered by tilting the board again. And the hydraulics, it is required to tilt the board. That's what strategy is all about. That's the abstracted principles. That's the contribution to the overall strategy that we can contribute. It would be even more ideal if this ball would be self-thinking, not having an own consciousness, but if it could be self-steering, so intelligent enough so that it could follow a given logic. So that way, risks can be identified in due time. You need to have precise control, short response times, and a fast reaction so that the ball doesn't fall off this board that is tilted time and again. That's what we understand by dynamic strategy. Professor Marketer says that countries with a high level of administration, such as the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, they seem to be rigid in their thinking. Major democratic apparatuses that work brilliantly for good routines. But new developments, reforms normally fail because there's too much resistance, too much friction, too much resistance against this change. It simply doesn't work in such major bureaucracies. Now there's another idea on resilience. We heard it from Mr. Bogensberger. This just goes to show that there's not really enough strategic thinking. So what we see is that in conurbations, where we try to supply people with everything they need. We have power lines, we have electricity lines, water lines, whatever. And sometimes these come through bottlenecks and we become increasingly vulnerable. So the logic should tell us that security is not by moving into big cities to make it very easy for your opponent to wipe out most of this organization with one weapon, or by offering bottlenecks where they can cut water lines or power lines in one point and thus cut off 2 million people from their water supply. No, you should have more decentralization. You should split it up. So if there's an aerial threat, we spread in order to provide the attacker with very little target. So we're not seeing that. Big cities, major conurbations, are exposed to terrorism. This possible radicalization is easier to have, in cities, and could be handled more easily in the countryside. But this is not even seen in its inception. As to cyber and asymmetry, cyber is often understood that we have a rotten boat with a wonderful coat of paint. Well, that won't help, and not only that, due to the varnish or paint, you can't see that the boat is indeed rotten. If we were to see that the planks are rotten, you could replace them and the boat would still float. But if you have a wonderful coat of paint that leads you to believe that it's still okay, well, then this will lead to a big disaster. So I think that that's what we often understand by resilience, and maybe this is why our minister is saying that resilience is not really a special concept. Now let me still talk about cyber. Just 3 sentences. This is something learned from Colonel Unger. So if you take cyber as an offset strategy, so have a big impact even against high-tech systems. So a 12-year-old boy in Baghdad can switch out the Pentagon. So if this 12-year-old can switch out the Pentagon, well, then we're helpless. But in reality, if you invest a little bit of money, you can maybe secure the systems more or less, so that if we invest a little bit more, such short-term shutdowns or failures can be fixed without any lasting damage. And if you were to invest a lot of money, like the US are doing, maybe by 2030, smaller states can be electronically switched off. So David versus Goliath, maybe that's now the steam hammer of Goliath that destroys David. So I believe that this helplessness against cyber that is reported in the West has such a narrative character. This brings me to the end of my presentation with Thucydides. Thucydides, you know him, in Athens. He was a strategist in the College of Strategists. I'm talking about the historian, not the politician and commander. So Thucydides is used in order to convey a narrative. We assume the US strategy, the democratic peace theory, that is characterized by liberal theories. According to Machiavelli, this means that if many parts of the world are under your control, well, you should use diluted forces. You should use the shotgun approach. So you bring them Western democracy, and that's the real reason behind, you secure trade access in the region. Now, the new administration obviously is not interested or doesn't believe in that. And the way it is presented is that this could also help you to be inferior to bigger opponents because you have this offset strategy. And the offset strategy of America, that was after the Second World War, it was the nuclear offset strategy. The second came after Vietnam. That was the space idea. The third one comes now with cyber, robotics, UAVs, unmanned aerial and underwater vehicles. And what's deceptive about this offset strategy that it does work, but only if you can afford to completely and utterly destroy your opponent. If that isn't successful, and if the opponent still has some capabilities, such an offset strategy means that you are stronger than I am, but I will do something really clever that you can't oppose with anything. That leads to an escalation. One example would be, let's say the Americans had a B-62-12, an intelligent nuclear bomb that can be fired from an aerial vehicle with a radius of 20 kilometers, and thus you could easily reach a smaller city and, well, switch it off. And the half-life of the radiation would be so low so that the aggressor could maybe use the city after 2 weeks' time. Well, this is a technology which, makes it more likely that you would use such a weapon. So if you have that, it's more readily used than a 20-kiloton bomb. But if the other side can't keep up technologically with that arm, with that weapon, well, what can they do? They can only, use intercontinental missiles. So you can see that if you can't completely and utterly destroy your opponent, this means that the opponent will react with, military means that are exactly what I didn't want. So either completely destroy your opponent or acknowledge that these offset strategies lead to further escalation and an arms race, and not disarmament. So even though it may sound paradoxical, but a key formula for communication with Russia lies in the fact that with conventional weapons at eye level, we do the arms race, and without betraying your own position, maybe you can negotiate at eye level with the Russian counterparts, rather than playing with offset ideas that lead to a new arms race. Now, on Thucydides and his trap. Well, that was the starting point. Thucydides, China, doesn't want this spreading of power, and that was the first one who used this pitfall. So in Athens, it was said that here next year there's a self-satisfied, smug naval power that is afraid of the Spartans. And the logic behind this is that this fear of the Spartans led to an arms race in Athens, and this arms race led to a terrible war. So the West is taking over this scenario. Graham Allison wrote a book where a lot of battles are analyzed, and is saying, can this be true? Can you prove that wherever somebody was afraid of his opponent and started an arms race, this inevitably turned into cruel wars? And Thucydides says, is war unavoidable? But this isn't really expressed by this Thucydides trap. There are two main questions. Is it true that this fear of this oversaturated hegemonial power, of the rising power, makes a war cruel? Well, Thucydides said, yes, that's true, because Athens well, built up too many arms against Sparta, the war became cruel. But the trigger of the war was that Sparta wanted to, extricate itself from this maritime dominance of Athens. So if both had quite rightfully feared each other, the war would have been unavoidable. So that's his conclusion. He's only saying that if there is something in this strategy that is really important to the opponent, a prestigious project, and you don't really need it for your own purposes, then you would be stupid to attack that very asset. That, he said, could sort of calm down the war somewhat. But as long as both don't give up this hegemonial claim to a territory, well, the war becomes unavoidable. And unilaterally giving up a claim is impossible. Just imagine two children on the swing. Well, while the swing is in motion, nobody can get off. Otherwise, the other one would be hit by the swing. So if somebody is in a hegemonial conflict, they can't get out. So this one-sided getting out means that the other will automatically win. So you can see, and that's what I tried to express by that, the conclusion is what's happening now is obviously a reorientation of American strategy of foreign policy in a direction that can be attributed to Mearsheimer. Mearsheimer is one of the most offensive neorealists, and he's speaking of a withdrawal of America from the world. And that didn't square with the fact that the Americans are, well, building up their capabilities in their fleet. But this withdrawal from the world doesn't mean withdrawing to America, but they're withdrawing from area-wide democratic peace theory from the world and a focus on three hotspots that he names: Russia, China, and the Near and Middle East, as long as there's oil there. And for these three hotspots where American hegemonial interests are substantially affected, this is where he wants to have armed forces. And the remainder of the world, this interference, and the rest of the globe, it always failed wherever they tried. It cost a lot, never worked. Why not? Well, he's saying that we don't need this, as Machiavelli thought, this intermediate ground. Whenever somebody affects our hegemonial interests, we want to act decisively. And now this arms race of the fleet squares with this withdrawal from the world, from the rest of the world. And I would like to end with a final comment, namely that we should believe that such a strategy, well, is written down by America and should have an escalating effect. One of the essential analysts of Russia, Fyodor Lukyanov, he wrote in his essay that's a strategy, well, with an uncovered face. So you see that there's somebody across from us and we know about his potentials, and these are potentials that we have an answer to. So essentially, he's saying that he is offering me to build an equilibrium, a balance. So that's a kind of a new fairness. So maybe the idea of focusing on conventional armament, and this could be having a destabilizing effect. And the offset strategies of brain versus potential to outmaneuver your opponent to maybe, well, fail in the process of trying to do so. Thank you for your attention. Questions during coffee or dinner. We will be here until midnight or longer. So thank you very much for your patience. Thank you.